This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Servile State by Hilaire Belloc. Section 14. Appendix on Buying Out. There is an impression abroad among those who propose to expropriate the capitalist class for the benefit of the State, but who appreciate the difficulties in the way of direct confiscation, that by spreading the process over a sufficient number of years and pursuing it after a certain fashion, bearing all the outward appearance of a purchase, the expropriation could be effected without the consequences and attendant difficulties of direct confiscation. In other words, there is an impression that the State could buy out the capitalist class without their knowing it, and that in a sort of painless way this class can be slowly conjured out of existence. The impression is held in a confused fashion by most of those who cherish it, and will not bear a clear analysis. It is impossible by any jugglery to buy out the universality of the means of production without confiscation. To prove this, consider a concrete case which puts the problem in the simplest terms. A community of 22 families lives upon the produce of 2 farms, the property of only 2 families out of that 22. The remaining 20 families are proletarian. The 2 families with their ploughs, stores, land, etc., are capitalists. The labour of the 20 proletarian families applied to the land, and the capital of these 2 capitalist families, produces 300 measures of wheat, of which 200 measures, or 10 measures each, form the annual support of the 20 proletarian families. The remaining 100 measures are the surplus value retained as rent, interest, and profit by the 2 capitalist families, each of which has thus a yearly income of 50 measures. The State proposes to produce, after a certain length of time, a condition of affairs such that the surplus values shall no longer go to the 2 capitalist families, but shall be distributed to the advantage of the whole community, while it, the State, shall itself become the unembarrassed owner of both farms. Now capital is accumulated with the object of a certain return as the reward of accumulation. Instead of spending his money, a man saves it with the object of retaining, as a result of that saving, a certain yearly revenue. The measure of this does not fall in a particular society at a particular time below a certain level. In other words, if a man cannot get a certain minimum reward for his accumulation, he will not accumulate, but spend. What is called in economics the law of diminishing returns acts so that continual additions to capital, other things being equal, that is, the methods of production remaining the same, do not provide a corresponding increase of revenue. 1,000 measures of capital applied to a particular area of natural forces will produce, for instance, 40 measures yearly, or 4%. But 2,000 measures applied in the same fashion will not produce 80 measures. They will produce more than the 1,000 measures did, but not more in proportion, not double. They will produce, say, 60 measures, or 3% upon the capital. The action of this universal principle automatically checks the accumulation of capital when it has reached such a point that the proportionate return is the least which a man will accept. If it falls below that, he will spend rather than accumulate. The limit of this minimum in any particular society at any particular time gives the measure to what we call the effective desire of accumulation. Thus, in England today, it is a little over 3%. The minimum which limits the accumulation of capital is a minimum return of about 1/30th yearly upon such capital, and this we may call for shortness the EDA of our society at the present time. When, therefore, the capitalist estimates the full value of his possessions, he counts them in so many years' purchase, and that means that he is willing to take in a lump sum down for his possessions so many times the yearly revenue which he at present enjoys. By an illusion which clever statesmanship could use to the advantage of the community. He even estimates the natural forces he controls, which need no accumulation but are always present, on the analogue of his capital, and will part with them at so many years' purchase. It is by taking advantage of this illusion that land purchase schemes, as in Ireland, happily work to the advantage of the dispossessed 1/30th. He will take a lump sum representing 30 times his annual revenue. So far, so good. Let us suppose the two capitalists in our example to have an EDA of 1/30th. They will sell to the State if the State can put up 3,000 measures of wheat. Now, of course, the State can do nothing of the kind. The accumulations of wheat being already in the hands of the capitalist, and those accumulations amounting to much less than 3,000 measures of wheat, the thing appears to be a deadlock. But it is not a deadlock if the capitalist is a fool. The State can go to the capitalist and say, "Hand me over your farms, and against them I will give you guarantee that you shall be paid rather more than 100 measures of wheat for a year for the 30 years. In fact, I will pay you half as much again until these extra payments amount to a purchase of your original stock." Out of what does this extra amount come? Out of the State's power to tax. The State can levy a tax upon the profits of both capitalist A and B and pay them the extra with their own money. In so simple an example, it is evident that this ringing of the changes would be spotted by the victims, and that they would bring against it precisely the same forces which they would bring against the much simpler and more straightforward process of immediate confiscation. But it is argued that in a complex state, where you are dealing with myriads of individual capitalists and thousands of particular forms of profit, the process can be masked. There are two ways in which the State can mask its action, according to this policy. It can buy out first one small area of land and capital out of the general taxation, and then another, until the whole land has been transferred. Or it can tax with peculiar severity certain trades which the rest who are left immune will abandon to their ruin, and with the general taxation, plus this special taxation, buy out those unfortunate trades which will, of course, have sunk heavily in value under the attack. The second of these tricks will soon be apparent in any society, however complex. For after one unpopular trade had been selected for attack, the trying on of the same methods in another less unpopular field will at once arouse suspicion. The first method, however, might have some chance of success, at least for a long time after it was begun, in a highly complex and numerous society, were it not for a certain check which comes in of itself. That check is the fact that the capitalist only takes more than his old yearly revenue with the object of reinvesting the surplus. I have £1,000 in Brighton railway stock yielding me 3%, 30 a year. The government asks me to exchange my bit of paper against another bit of paper guaranteeing the payment of 50 a year. That is an extra rate a year for so many years as will represent, over and above the regular interest paid, a purchase of my stock. The government's bit of paper promises to pay to the holder 50 a year for, say, 38 years. I am delighted to make the exchange, not because I am such a fool as to enjoy the prospect of my property being extinguished at the end of 38 years, but because I hope. Thus you can raid the brewers in a society, half Puritan, where brewing is thought immoral by many, but proceed to railway stock, and it would be a very different matter to be able to reinvest the extra 20 every year in something else that will bring me in 3%. Thus, at the end of the 38 years, I shall, or my heirs, be better off than I was at the beginning of the transaction, and I shall have enjoyed during its maturing my old 30 a year all the same. The State can purchase thus on a small scale, by subsidizing purchase out of the general taxation. It can therefore play this trick over a small area and for a short time with success. But the moment this area passes a very narrow limit, the market for investment is found to be restricted. Capital automatically takes alarm. The State can no longer offer its paper guarantee save at an enhanced price. if it tries to turn the position by further raising taxation to what capital regards as confiscatory rates, there will be opposed to its action just the same forces as would be opposed to frank and open expropriation. The matter is one of plain arithmetic, and all the confusion introduced by the complex mechanism of finance can no more change the fundamental and arithmetical principles involved than can the accumulation of triangles in an ordnance survey reduce the internal angles of the largest triangle to less than 180 degrees. In fine, if you desire to confiscate, you must confiscate. You cannot outflank the enemy as financiers in the city and sharpers on the racecourse outflank the simpler of mankind, nor can you conduct the general process of expropriation upon a muddle-headed hope that somehow or other something will come out of nothing in the end. There are indeed two ways in which the State could expropriate without meeting the resistance that must be present against any attempt at confiscation. But the first of these ways is precarious and the second insufficient. In using this metaphor, I at once record my apologies to those who believe in elliptical and hyperbolic universes, and confess myself an old-fashioned parabolist. Further, I admit that the triangles in question are spherical. They are as follows. The State can promise the capitalist a larger yearly revenue than he is getting in the expectation that it, the State, can manage the business better than the capitalist, or that some future expansion will come to its aid. In other words, if the State makes a bigger profit out of the thing than the capitalist, it can buy out the capitalist just as a private individual with a similar business proposition can buy him out. But the converse of this is that if the State has calculated badly, or has bad luck, it would find itself endowing the capitalists of the future instead of gradually extinguishing them. In this fashion, the State could have socialized, without confiscation, the railways of this country if it had taken them over 50 years ago, promising the then owners more than they were then obtaining. But if it had socialized the hansom cab in the 90s, it would now be supporting in perpetuity that worthy but extinct type, the cab owner and his children forever, at the expense of the community. The second way in which the State can expropriate without confiscation is by annuity. It can say to such capitalists as have no heirs, or care little for their fate if they have, you have only got so much time to live and to enjoy your 30. You will take 50 until you die. Upon the bargain being accepted, the State will, in process of time, though not immediately upon the death of the annuitant, become an unembarrassed owner of what had been the annuitant's share in the means of production. But the area over which this method can be exercised is a very small one. It is not of itself sufficient instrument for the expropriation of any considerable field. I need hardly add that, as a matter of fact, the so-called socialist and confiscatory measures of our time have nothing to do with the problem here discussed. The State is indeed confiscating, that is, it is taxing in many cases in such a fashion as to impoverish the taxpayer, and is lessening his capital rather than shearing his income. But it is not putting the proceeds into the means of production. It is either using them for immediate consumption in the shape of new official salaries, or handing them over to another set of capitalists. But these practical considerations of the way in which sham socialist experiments are working belong rather to my next section, in which I shall deal with the actual beginnings of the Servile State in our midst. Thus the money levied upon the death of some not very wealthy squire, and represented by, say, locomotives in the Argentine, turns into 2 miles of palings for the pleasant back gardens of 1,000 new officials under the Inebriates Bill, or is simply handed over to the shareholders of the Prudential under the Insurance Act. In the first case, the locomotives have been given back to the Argentine, and after a long series of exchanges have been bartered against a great number of wood palings from the Baltic, not exactly reproductive wealth. In the second case, the locomotives, which used to be the squire's hands, become, or their equivalent becomes, means of production in the hands of the sassoons. End of section 14.